The 14th of October, 1943. A farmhouse outside Lyon, shuttered against the autumn rain. Inside, a young woman sits at a wooden table, her hands steady despite the German patrol she can hear passing on the road outside. On the table in front of her lies a strange, elongated tube of dull gray metal, no longer than a man's forearm, fitted with a small wooden grip at one end. It looks less like a weapon and more like a piece of plumbing equipment, something a tradesman might carry in a toolbox. She checks the single round chambered inside, slides the bolt forward with barely a click, and waits. Within the hour, a German officer responsible for the recent execution of 3 resistance fighters will walk past this farmhouse on his evening route, as he does every evening, with the same predictable arrogance of a man who believes himself untouchable in occupied territory. He will not hear the shot that kills him. Witnesses 200 meters away will hear nothing beyond the rustle of wind through the plane trees lining the road. The weapon responsible for his death will already be wrapped in cloth and buried beneath a woodpile before his body is discovered. This is the story of the Welrod, a pistol so quiet that German soldiers who encountered its effects without ever identifying its source began referring to unexplained silent killings in the field as the work of something they called unsichtbarer Todd. Invisible death. It was not magic. It was not myth. It was British engineering, built in absolute secrecy, designed by men who understood that the most important weapon in irregular warfare was not the one that killed the most efficiently, but the one that left the enemy with no idea where the killing blow had come from. Why this particular weapon mattered cannot be measured simply in lives taken. It mattered because it allowed ordinary people, farmers, schoolteachers, shop clerks recruited into resistance networks across occupied Europe, to strike against an occupying army with a tool that gave them a fighting chance of survival afterwards. That, more than any single assassination, is why the Welrod deserves to be remembered. To understand why Britain needed a weapon like this, you have to understand the peculiar nature of the war being fought in the shadows of occupied Europe from 1940 onwards. Following the fall of France, Britain found itself without a continental army, without the conventional means to strike back at Nazi Germany on the ground. What it did have, increasingly, was a sprawling, improvised network of resistance movements across France, Norway, the Low Countries, and beyond. Ordinary civilians willing to sabotage, inform, and occasionally kill on behalf of the Allied cause. The organization built to support these networks, the Special Operations Executive, established in July 1940 on Winston Churchill's instruction to set Europe ablaze, faced an immediate and unglamorous problem. Conventional firearms were loud. A standard pistol shot could be heard for several hundred meters in open countryside and considerably further in the close confines of a town or village. For a uniformed soldier on a battlefield, this hardly mattered. For an agent or resistance fighter operating in plain clothes, surrounded by civilians and enemy patrols alike, a gunshot was effectively an alarm bell announcing both the act and, often, the location of the person responsible. Existing suppressed weapons offered only partial answers. Standard firearms, fitted with aftermarket suppressors, remained audible at close range, often producing a sharp crack that, while quieter than an unsuppressed shot, was still instantly recognizable as gunfire to anyone nearby. Worse, many suppressors of the period degraded quickly, losing effectiveness after a handful of shots as the internal baffles wore down from the heat and pressure of repeated firing. None of this was good enough for the kind of work SOE needed to support: close-range assassination, sentry removal, and the elimination of collaborators, often in settings where a single audible shot could compromise an entire network of operatives who had spent months building cover identities. There was a further problem, one that was as much psychological as technical. Resistance operatives were, for the most part, not soldiers. They were civilians who had received perhaps a few weeks of training, if that often delivered hastily by SOE instructors at country houses requisitioned across the English countryside. They needed something that did not require expert marksmanship or extensive familiarity with firearms to use effectively under extreme stress, ideally at point-blank range, where the chances of a clean, silent kill were highest and the chances of detection lowest. By 1942, the scale of underground resistance activity across occupied Europe had grown substantially, and with it the demand for tools suited to this strange, intimate form of warfare. The War Office and SOE leadership recognized that improvised solutions, modified service revolvers, crude, homemade suppressors fashioned by enthusiastic amateurs, simply would not suffice for an operation expected to expand dramatically as preparations for an eventual continental invasion gathered pace. A purpose-built weapon was required, one engineered from first principles around the single overriding requirement of near-total silence. The task fell to the Station 9 Research and Development Facility at Welwyn Garden City in Hertfordshire, a country house and surrounding grounds that, to any casual passer-by, resembled nothing more exotic than a minor agricultural research station. In reality, the scientists and engineers working there, operating under conditions of considerable secrecy even by wartime standards, were responsible for an extraordinary range of clandestine equipment, from explosive devices disguised as everyday objects to specialized radio equipment for agents operating behind enemy lines. The man most closely associated with the resulting weapon was Major Hugh Reeves, working alongside a small team of engineers who approached the silencing problem not as an afterthought, bolting a suppressor onto an existing design, but as the foundational principle around which the entire weapon would be built. This distinction mattered enormously. Most suppressed firearms of the era were adaptations. The Welrod, named in part for Welwyn and in part for its inventor, was conceived from the outset as an integrated whole. The genius of the design lay in two separate but complementary innovations. First, the weapon was built around a relatively low-powered cartridge, typically chambered in either .32 or 9mm caliber, fired through a barrel that was itself perforated with small holes along its length. As the bullet passed through these perforations, propellant gases bled away gradually into a surrounding expansion chamber, rather than escaping in the single violent burst that produces the characteristic crack of a normal gunshot. Imagine the difference between popping a balloon and slowly releasing the air from it through a narrow valve. The energy is the same, but the sound it produces is entirely different. Second, and just as crucially, the weapon employed a manually operated bolt action rather than the self-loading mechanism found in most contemporary pistols. This was a deliberate sacrifice of speed for silence. Self-loading pistols cycle their action using the energy of the fired cartridge, which means the mechanical clatter of the slide moving backward and forward becomes part of the overall sound signature of the shot, a metallic clack that suppressors cannot eliminate because it has nothing to do with the noise of combustion. By requiring the user to manually cycle the bolt between shots, much like working the action of a bolt-action rifle, the Welrod eliminated this mechanical noise entirely. The trade-off was rate of fire. This was not a weapon for a sustained engagement. It was a weapon for a single, decisive moment. The resulting pistol measured roughly 31 centimeters in length and weighed approximately 1.1 kilograms, depending on the variant, figures that placed it firmly in the territory of a substantial pistol rather than a compact, concealable weapon. Its magazine, holding either 6 or 8 rounds depending on caliber, was cleverly disguised, forming part of the grip itself, an arrangement that gave the entire weapon an unassuming, vaguely industrial appearance when glimpsed quickly. Several variants existed, refined across the war years, with later models becoming somewhat shorter and more ergonomic as feedback from field use filtered back to Welwyn. The sound the weapon produced when fired has been variously described by those who handled it as comparable to a heavy book being dropped onto a wooden table, or the muffled thud of a car door closing at a moderate distance. Crucially, this sound bore no resemblance to gunfire whatsoever to the untrained ear, which meant that even when a shot was heard nearby, witnesses frequently failed to recognize what they had actually heard until well after the fact, if at all. Production took place under conditions of tight secrecy, with components manufactured at various locations across Britain before final assembly, reportedly numbering somewhere in the low thousands across the war, though exact figures remain difficult to verify given the classified nature of SOE production records, many of which were deliberately destroyed after the war or remain restricted even today. What can be said with confidence is that the weapon was distributed sparingly and selectively, reserved for situations where its specific qualities, silence above all else, were considered essential to mission success. Documentation of specific operational uses remains frustratingly incomplete, a consequence both of the secretive nature of the missions themselves and the simple fact that successful silent assassinations, by their very design, were intended to leave behind as little evidence as possible. What survives are fragments, operational reports, post-war debriefings, and the occasional account preserved in resistance memoirs published decades later. Among the better documented cases is the use of the Welrod by Danish resistance fighters, targeting collaborators and informants whose activities had compromised resistance cells, with several recorded incidents in Copenhagen during 1944 in which targets were eliminated at close range in circumstances where no gunshot was reported by nearby witnesses despite the proximity of the killing. French resistance networks operating in and around Lyon and the wider Rhone Valley are similarly believed to have employed the weapon against Gestapo informants, though specific operational records linking named individuals to the Welrod specifically, as opposed to other clandestine weapons supplied by SOE, are scarce. The psychological effect on occupying forces, even where the material death toll attributable specifically to this weapon remained modest in the wider context of the war, should not be underestimated. German security forces investigating unexplained killings of officers and collaborators frequently found themselves baffled by the absence of any audible gunshot reported by nearby civilians, fueling rumors and unease that spread through occupied communities and, eventually, through German ranks themselves. Soldiers operating in regions with active resistance cells became markedly more cautious, more suspicious of seemingly ordinary civilians, a corrosive uncertainty that, while difficult to quantify, undoubtedly complicated German occupation efforts and diverted resources towards counterintelligence that might otherwise have been deployed elsewhere. It is worth being honest about the limits of what we know. Many claimed uses of the Welrod in popular retellings rest on secondary accounts, post-war embellishment, or simple conflation with other suppressed weapons of the period. Exact casualty figures attributable specifically to this weapon do not exist in any reliable, comprehensive form, and likely never will. Germany, despite its formidable wartime engineering reputation, never developed a true equivalent. German suppressed weapons of the period, where they existed at all, tended to follow the conventional approach of adapting existing service pistols with bolt-on suppressors, an approach that delivered modest noise reduction but nothing approaching the near silence achieved by the Welrod's integrated design. This is a curious gap in German wartime engineering, one likely explained by doctrine rather than capability. German military culture placed relatively little institutional emphasis on supporting partisan-style irregular warfare conducted by civilian operatives, since Germany, as the occupying power across most of the continent, had comparatively little need for the kind of clandestine, deniable weaponry that British planners required to support resistance movements operating against German forces. The Americans, entering the secret war somewhat later through the Office of Strategic Services, developed their own suppressed pistol, the high-standard HDM, based on a commercially available .22 caliber target pistol fitted with an effective integral suppressor. The American approach prioritized a smaller, lighter weapon better suited to concealment, sacrificing some stopping power for portability, reflecting subtly different operational priorities between the two Allied intelligence services. Where the Welrod was built from the ground up as a dedicated assassination tool with no pretense of conventional utility, the American design retained more of the character of its commercial origins. Neither weapon was definitively superior to the other in absolute terms, Rather, each reflected the particular doctrinal preferences and operational contexts of the service that commissioned it. It is worth noting that the basic principle underlying the Welrod, an integrally suppressed barrel combined with a manually operated action, would go on to influence suppressed weapon design for decades afterwards, with later Cold War-era intelligence services on both sides of the Iron Curtain developing their own variations on essentially the same underlying concept. Assessing the precise historical impact of the Welrod requires a degree of intellectual honesty that popular retellings often lack. This was never going to be a weapon that altered the strategic course of the war. Its production numbers were modest, its use highly specialized, and its targets, while sometimes of genuine intelligence or security value, were rarely figures whose removal single-handedly shifted the balance of the occupation. Its true significance lies elsewhere, in the quieter, harder-to-measure realm of what it enabled, rather than what it directly achieved. It gave resistance networks across occupied Europe a tool that matched the peculiar demands of their fight, allowing ordinary people with minimal training to strike against an occupying force while preserving, as much as any weapon could, their chances of escaping detection afterwards. In a form of warfare where survival of the network mattered as much as any single operation's success, that quality was worth more than raw lethality. The weapon's influence on post-war special operations and intelligence weapon design is more clearly traceable. Variants and conceptual descendants of the Welrod's integrally suppressed, manually cycled design philosophy appeared in the arsenals of intelligence services throughout the Cold War, suggesting that whatever its limited wartime production numbers, the underlying engineering principle had proven its worth conclusively enough to be studied, copied, and refined by later generations of weapon designers working in similarly clandestine contexts. Surviving examples of the Welrod can today be found in several military and intelligence museums, including the Imperial War Museum in London, where examples are occasionally displayed alongside other artifacts of SOE's clandestine arsenal, offering visitors a chance to see, up close, just how unremarkable and unthreatening this device appears, a quality that was, after all, entirely intentional. Return for a moment to that farmhouse outside Lyon, 14 October 1943, rain against the shutters and a young woman with steady hands. The weapon she held that evening was not designed to win the war outright. It was not meant to topple armies or decide the fate of nations through sheer destructive force. It was designed to do something smaller and, in its way, more remarkable: to give an ordinary person, with no military training and no soldier's resources, a fighting chance to strike at tyranny and walk away afterwards, unseen, unheard, unidentified. That is what made the Welrod extraordinary, not its lethality, which was modest by the standards of modern weaponry, but its philosophy. It was built around silence as a survival mechanism for the people using it, not merely a tactical advantage. Every design choice, the perforated barrel, the manually cycled bolt, the unassuming industrial appearance, served that single, unglamorous purpose. German soldiers who whispered of unsichtbarer Tod, of invisible death stalking their officers and informants in the shadows of occupied towns, were not describing a myth, even if they never understood precisely what they were facing. They were describing the quiet, deliberate consequence of a small team of British engineers at a requisitioned country house, working in secrecy, solving a problem that conventional military thinking had never needed to confront. How do you arm a civilian to fight an army and give them a chance of surviving the fight? The Welrod never made headlines. It was never celebrated in the way the Spitfire or the Mosquito would be celebrated in the decades after the war. It was not built for glory, and it received none. It was built for silence, and in silence it did exactly what it was designed to do. Invisible death indeed. Sometimes the quietest weapons leave the loudest legacy.